Hey there, John.
Howdy, Ryan.
Hey, and so we were breaking up the form a little bit of whatever it is we do here. On today's episode of the Socratic, I guess we're just going to kind of talk about current events, which today was a pretty monumental day in many folks' minds. You want to walk us through what occurred today, John?
Yeah. Well, I guess either sometime last night or in the early hours of the morning, the U.S. launched strikes at various military targets, primarily, I think, but it seems like maybe there were a few things that would fall more in the line of like civilian targets in Venezuela, but the primary goal, it appears, was a targeted strike by, I think, Delta Force, it seems, to basically extract Nicolas Maduro, who is the president of Venezuela, and his wife from their residence in the middle of the night, and basically extracted them, and they are now on a U.S. bound naval ship. And supposedly he's going to stand trial, I guess him and his wife, for various crimes he's being charged with. Seems mostly related to drug offenses, some, I think, terrorism charges perhaps as well. Probably some
Narco-terrorism.
Yeah, narco-terrorism, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess to start off, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and we'll probably go back and forth for a bit on this topic. I will say that there certainly have been, I've been on Reddit today, there have been comments from people living in Venezuela, and many of them are, it would appear, happy about Maduro being gone, but it's obviously, as they've said, it's more complicated than that, because, what's going to replace him, what exactly is going to, happen. And of course, he is also popular with, at a minimum, certain elements of the country. There have been pro Maduro, protests and stuff like already going on. People, armed in the street, basically not happy that, the U.S. violated their sovereignty and all of that. So, at a minimum, it's a very complicated situation, and we're going to try to dig into some of the varying elements of it, and, maybe even beyond weighing in on just, the ethics of this, possibly also talking about just practically speaking, is this a good idea? What kind of precedent does this set for the future? In regards to geopolitics more broadly, as well as things like international law, rules-based, order, things like this. So we're gonna just kind of get into some of the ramifications of today's, for lack of a better word, kidnapping of a foreign president on his own soil.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the
What are your
practicality of it all, I'd be interested to get your take, John, on what, so obviously our motives and our, mandate to do any of this obviously is questionable. However, in some ways, I think like the way that this was done was at least very efficient. Imagine if the Iraq War had been conducted in this fashion.
Right. Yeah, just went in, got Saddam, and left, kind of thing. Yeah.
Right, and I guess, who knows what the aftermath will be here. Who knows what the aftermath would have been in that case, or in any, unstable situation when you remove the leadership. There's an open question as to what fills that vacuum of power.
Absolutely.
But I guess there is something to be said that this was, relatively successful for what it was.
Yeah, as military operation goes, quite frankly, I'm a little surprised that it appears we caught the Venezuelans with their proverbial pants down here. you wouldn't normally expect it would be seemingly kind of easy as it was to
Basically
just kind of
right in.
fly
Especially
in and
after
do
like
this,
months
so.
of antagonism and rattling
Right.
the cage.
Right.
You'd
It
think
wasn't.
there'd be some measure of precaution being taken against this possibility, right?
Yeah. It wasn't. Although, unless you could argue that maybe they thought, it's never wise to underestimate one's enemy, but it is certainly something that has happened repeatedly throughout history, that occasionally things that are just so audacious are not even really viewed to be in the realm of possibility by people, and so that's
Right.
part of perhaps how they were taken off guard here. Maybe they just, for all of Trump's bluster and whatnot, maybe they didn't think that this could even be possible, or that they would actually dare to attempt something like this.
Right, yeah, and I think in many frameworks, it's not surprising that the United States is, conducting military strategy in a way that aligns with its economic interests, and perhaps only doing it out of those economic interests, right? There's certainly many naysayers of the ethics of how the United States comports itself. However, I think it's pretty unprecedented how bold-faced this was done, and without any seeming collaboration.
Pretense.
What was that?
Any seeming pretense to
Right,
following
any
the
pretense,
rules, or
again, if we go back to the Iraq War as one of the most recent, full-scale invasions of the United States into another sovereign country, there was quite a bit of recognition in the international community that there was an issue there that needed intervention. And that doesn't seem to be the case here with Venezuela. So I guess there's probably something to be said for, sure, the U.S. is on the coast, out in open waters, being belligerent. However, what chances are they really going to? Are they really just going to go and invade it out in the open while everyone's watching with zero, pretense to do so? And apparently we would.
yeah,
And I guess, to many that's probably not surprising. It is surprising how quickly it was done and with as little pretense, I guess is a good word, whether fabricated or not. It's just pretty weak reasoning what we have right now, right? And we really didn't do much to build up the case. And that is unprecedented. And so I guess in terms of getting caught with their pants down, there I think should have been good reason to believe that there's no way that a massive strike like this was coming. And yet here we are.
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of similar to the Ukrainian invasion, right? Where, sure, Russia is belligerent, right? But,
Right.
When was the last time a European power invaded another sovereign country in Europe, right?
Yeah.
And again, after the fact, Russia is an aggressor. No one's surprised that it was Russia that did that. But the fact that they did that, again, out in the open, with so little pretense, it was startling, right? And I guess that combined with the way that the U.S. is now comporting itself, as well as probably some other signals, we're looking at pretty broadly recognized disruption in what the world order was for the latter half of the 20th century, where most of the economic superpowers were playing nice and at least pretending to have an ethical ground to stand on. Meanwhile, at this point in time, it seems like that's kind of a thing of the past.
Yeah, it seems like it's definitely
problematic.
thrown up at the window. Yeah. A few things, I guess. Certainly in retrospect, we know that the WMD's shit was all bullshit, with Iraq and all of that. But they did go to some lengths to present a case, I guess, if you will, to the international community. It was also carried out with a coalition of our allies. At least based on what I read, it seems like Starmer, who's the current prime minister in Britain, was completely blindsided by this. So obviously Britain is, typically considered to be one of our closest allies, and it would appear that we did not even inform them that this was in the offing or anything like that. They sort of found out along with the rest of us. So,
which again would be surprising in most circumstances. However, under this administration, we have to start beginning to expand our notion of what's possible.
What's possible, yeah.
In terms of American behaviors.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's definitely something different. Obviously, the Iraq War was illegal. We know that now. And I strongly doubt that the 1.5 million Iraqis that, died as a result probably care too much about whether or not, we went to this effort of setting up, more justification and things ahead of time and tried to build more international consensus before doing what we did. But I do still think that there is a sense that this signals a very dangerous precedent moving forward where if we just take the whim, well, who's next? I mean, like, he's already literally just in the last couple hours, he's also been now talking about, like, Mexico. It's just like once you sort of open this door, it's like, well, who's going to stop us? I mean, the one thing that the U.S. does still have is the most powerful military in the world. Like, are we just going to start wielding it, whenever?
Right, and there's a question, how well can we wield that? How well can we project force, like, on the other side of the globe, right? So, like, if China were to invade Taiwan, how effectively can we really prevent that or come to Taiwan's aid? Right. However, given the size of our military, if we're thinking about more local conflicts, we are, as you said, still the most powerful military in the world. And so, although, like, we certainly have rivals and we certainly have weaknesses in a way that we didn't back in the 20th century, there should be worry from our neighbors who were once allies and who Trump has been talking about disrupting their sovereignty in a way that I think to some at least was kind of like humorous for a while. Canada, like, are we going to invade Canada? I mean, obviously not, but like, would we have just on a whim invaded Venezuela, a year ago? No, of course not. So now some things are on the table that weren't in the past, right? Because Trump talked about Greenland, talked about Canada, talked about Mexico, talked about Panama, talked about Venezuela. Venezuela, we've now, gotten our fingers in the dough over there in a pretty significant manner. And as you said, with the Iraq War, obviously for the people on the ground, it doesn't really matter. The U.S. built consensus, but there was a game that was being played at that time that was different from this game, right? And the fact that you required, like, the collaboration and the consensus of the global community in order to, begin on a conflict, that meant that a wider pair of eyes needed to be set on the issue and have agreement on that. So it was obviously safer in many ways to constrain the world superpowers in that fashion, whether or not it still ended up with some issues, some conflicts that were done in an illegal manner after the fact, right? So obviously if that game was still being played, we couldn't have done this with Venezuela. So this is a change in the state of the game. And it's one that is, if you're not a fan of war, problematic, because this means that many other conflicts can be done more openly, more brazenly, and more immediately just based on whim, because you don't have to build that international consensus and you may not give a damn about it.
Yeah, and I guess you brought up China briefly, and it probably bears saying now that it obviously, like, they've had interests in, Taiwan. Of course, they view it as part of their country. It's a little bit less, the waters are a little murkier there, I'll say, historically and whatever. As you noted in their response to this, they, said that it was, like, concerning and that they noted specifically the, what was the thing they said? It was, China is deeply shocked and strongly condemns the use of force by the U.S. against a sovereign country and the use of force against the president of a country. Obviously, one could argue there that that their use of sovereign country is intentional because obviously they don't view Taiwan to be a sovereign country. Right? Yeah. And so they're probably setting up something of like a back door for themselves to potentially do that. But also, just from a precedent standpoint, obviously, I don't think the U.S. has had moral high ground to speak of in, for sure half a century, probably longer. But if we want to think in terms of, having something of the moral high ground, like how could we possibly, with a straight face at this point, say anything to China if they decided to move against Taiwan? It would seem almost laughable at that point, given what we've just done. It was also hilarious that the Russians, Venezuela is an ally of theirs, but that they, of course, chimed in about how this was illegal and everything as they're doing what they're doing in Ukraine. Just somehow, like, so on the nose, it's almost impossible to reconcile that one, I guess. But yeah, I think generally speaking, whatever you think of individual, leaders or dictators or whatever you want to call them of, various countries, it's probably generally speaking a bad idea if another country can just decide to invade another, and for almost any type of excuse. Obviously, I think that there is some, for sure call and room for like something like a coalition of UN forces if, the world comes together and decides that what is going on somewhere is unacceptable, and that what will be required will be some type of military intervention in order to stop a genocide, for instance. I think that there is that should be able to be on the table. Hopefully it would be more of a later resort type of thing and not the first thing that you would do. Obviously you would try other things first, but at least there, if it was like a coalition, the United Nations, I think that there'd be more sense of like, okay, we might be able to justify this as a humanitarian endeavor. But obviously the problem when one country does it, whether that's the U.S. or Russia, it's much easier to see other motives being the primary ones. I mean, Trump hasn't really tried to hide this too much at all. I mean, we're sort of covering in the guise of this narco-terrorism stuff, but he also pretty much just came out and said that it was oil, today. So, and that, we're going to open up, their, oil reserves to American oil companies again, like, which is kind of, seems to be pretty much the underlying real cause, of this. If, as somebody pointed out, I saw online, if they, if he really cared about drugs and that sort of thing, he wouldn't have just pardoned that drug kingpin guy or whatever. So it really feels like, and obviously too, just as a very brief aside, the number one way to address like the problem with drug addiction and stuff in the U.S. It's not going around and bombing some people in poor places that grow opium or cocaine or whatever else. It's obviously to do something about poverty and healthcare in America and improving prospects in that respect. So again, this is like, even if even if we can't acknowledge things like the problem with increasing like addiction and stuff like in the U.S., this is clearly not the best solution. I'm not even certain it's really much of a solution at all. Somehow I doubt we are going to see much effect on American narcotic use because we captured Nicolas Maduro. So yeah, it's pretty clear this was. Yeah, I was just say it's pretty clear this was done for economic, oil-based reasons.
Yeah, and that's what's so, I guess, it again, surprising about this, and perhaps you shouldn't be surprised, but it is in many ways unprecedented. And again, like, if you think about like the question of how do we deal with drug addiction, right? There is a spectrum of those who believe it's more, caused by poverty, and that we should be supporting people with addictions, perhaps providing needles, so that any addictions are done in a cleaner sense, and more, what do I call it? What's the opposite of authoritarian in terms of parenting? what's the other, more, less authoritarian ways to handle this.
Or
But
libertarian
more,
or something,
more ethically
less hands-on.
sound. Less hands-on ways to handle that, right? And then you have more like, we just need to get rid of all the drugs. We need to impose very strict laws that will
flood the street with more cops,
significant consequences. Yeah, we need more cops. Yeah, exactly. So there's a spectrum of like, how do we handle with this? No one, it really seems like a very small portion of that spectrum would agree that bombing Venezuela and capturing their leader is like how we're going to solve addiction or drug use in America, right? In the same way that you could put on a spectrum, people's appetite for war, right? And on one side you have the doves, who are very anti-war, and then on another side you have very, very, hawks that are interested in like, anytime we have a conflict with someone, it's fine for us to go to war. Even there, like, the amount of people that would agree with what we just did with very little precedent, winnows down to a very small portion of the spectrum. And again, to go back to the Iraq War, the more that you make a case for our intervention into another sovereign country's affairs, the more you're going to open up the amount of population that is agreeing with that method of achieving those ends, right? But since there's so little justification that was given and so little evidence for a reason to intervene, you end up with a very small portion of just the acolytes, right? The people who drank in the Kool-Aid on if Venezuela is evil, so we need to intervene, or Venezuela is pumping drugs into our country, so we need to intervene. And I just don't know what portion of the population really fits or will find those explanations meaningful.
Yeah, and quite frankly, to bring history into this, I would feel like at this point, anybody that buys any of these kind of humanitarian-based justifications for most anything that we do geopolitically has to be naive in the extreme, given the past 80 years, post-World War II like era history here, because to bring in one of our favorite ideas from Noam Chomsky, you have worthy and unworthy victims. Basically, the U.S. only ever trumps up humanitarian justifications for invading somewhere when it's like one of our enemies, somebody that isn't playing ball with us, and we have a long, long track record of ignoring anything, even the egregious and heinous actions of our allies. We obviously don't need to go any further than what Israel is doing in Palestine currently in order to see that. So anybody that's buying that the U.S. government ever gives a fuck about human rights somewhere, for sure as a primary concern, is naive in the extreme.
Right, but so that idea of worthy versus unworthy victims comes from Noam Chomsky's, or at least the first way that I ran into it is Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent, right? And that when you position the people of other countries or the regimes of other countries who are looking to intervene as people that morally should be intervened with, that's when you build consent for intervention, right? So when you manufacture consent, that's using the media apparatus and the news, the news machine to inform people of events in a way that either is fabricated or twists the facts to make it appear as if our intervention is worthwhile, and not just for us but also for the rest of the globe and maybe even for the people of those other countries, right? But that's the thing, is like right here, sure, these are what generally we would consider in Chomsky's paradigm unworthy victims, meaning they're not, the people in Venezuela are not part of quote unquote the West, they're not part of quote unquote the first world, the industrialized world. So generally we need to do less, the media apparatus needs to do less in order to convince a broad portion of the population to support intervention like that, right? Because the groundwork has already been laid that they're not our people, so we don't need to give like a huge justification to go in there. However, even that bare minimum was not done here. And no matter what, even if we consider, like you and I are people that are relatively critical of the US's ethics or intentions when they engage in conflicts abroad, right? Not everyone everyone's like that, right? So again, you have a spectrum of people that are more critical of the U.S. or more trusting of U.S.'s motives. But no matter what, if you give less justification at the media level, at the governmental level, at the political level, then you're winnowing that support in every sector there, right? There's still people that no matter what are going to be like, oh, it's just Venezuela. But the number of people that would say that if we gave a justification is larger if a justification was given. When you give no justification, you're reducing that base of support. And we've basically done this by building up no support around it, right? It was purely the Trump administration operating on their own. Congress completely derelict. They didn't do anything to stop this, right? Despite multiple bills being proposed to intervene in the executive branch's ability to make war in this capacity, which they're not supposed to be legally able to do of their own accord, right? It should be Congress that's declaring war, and they didn't do anything. And the Trump, the executive branch basically has gotten no support, has not sought support from any other sector of the government or from the broader population or the global international community, right? They've done this unilaterally on their own without building a consent or consensus from anyone else, which is unprecedented in a way. And so no matter what, even if these were worthy or unworthy victims, they didn't even go through the strokes of manufacturing the consent in Noam Chomsky's model. They basically just said, F it, we're going to do it anyway. And, again, as is often the case with the Trump presidency, we'll see who tries to stop us. We'll see if there's any consequences.
Yeah.
And often this first year of the second Trump presidency, there haven't been many consequences that have been imposed domestically. And now I guess here's a chance to see if in such a brazen disregard for international law, if anyone internationally will hold him to account.
Yeah, I mean, if there was any justice, you would like to think that Europe and China and Brazil and the rest of the reasonably sized players kind of around the world would turn around and do to us basically like what we've been and these other members of the the world have been doing to Russia with sanctions and trading less or cutting off trade and all these things, making like them into like a pariah state is definitely something along the lines that we probably would deserve, quite frankly.
Which is again problematic because that would be a punishment that is extended to the United States and to the government of the United States, but also the people of the United States, who again weren't really given even the opportunity to say yes or no to this to this action, right?
Yeah,
there was no support really built. Obviously, that's being said against the fact that we put Donald Trump back into the presidency, which is something that the American population did do, right? So, and they do need to be held to account for that. But this is the problem with authoritarian regimes, and not to necessarily say that the Trump presidency is all the way authoritarian or that the U.S. is an authoritarian state, but as a executive branch takes more and more unilateral actions without conferring with other branches of government or with the population itself, they're engaging in more authoritarian action, right? Yeah. They're doing 100%. Things more unilaterally. And this is a very clear example of the Trump presidency doing something without building any consent from people or other branches of Congress. And so as that is allowed, then the only response from other nations is to impose sanctions or other forms of intervention on the country as a whole. And unfortunately, that means that the consequences are borne by the people rather than the administration, which is the portion of the country that actually did the wrong action.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. But yeah, it also, I guess, sort of raises the question of, who's next? Are we going to just try to do this anytime we feel like it or anytime somebody refuses to play ball with us? Yesterday I was likening it to, it feels, or this morning rather, I was likening to, it feels very much like we are the gangsters essentially now just running a protection racket. Are we going to just like start threatening people like, hey, give us $1 billion or we'll
it's a nice
kidnap your president.
It'd be a shame if something would happen to it.
Yeah. Are we just going to
start launching
missile strikes?
We wouldn't want anyone kidnapping your prime minister now, would we?
Yeah. No, for real. I mean, it's like sort of humorous, but it's also not, because this apparently is like now the reality, and it's just like, what do you do? In a world where like this becomes like accepted, or at a minimum, even if a lot of people don't care for it, no one's stopping us. We'll just keep doing it. It's back to might makes right, and
Right.
uh, which was the way that the world operated for the overwhelming amount of world history,
Yep.
and we to the basically effect that we had almost constant warfare, pretty much through most of history. Like, when violence is becomes the first resort to resolve disputes, it's not good. It's not good for anybody, and it's not good for stability. It's not good economically, for trade purposes, for any number of things. And in the latter half of the 20th century, there was this idea that maybe we had tried to move. We'd learned something about the mistakes of the past, and we were trying to build something better going forward. We were going to have fewer wars. Less violence, more stability, more trade, more economic, flow from place to place. And now, if this just goes back to, well, whoever has the biggest stick, can decide things. And I would also, for anybody that's like, well, we've got the big stick, so, why should we care? Well, world history changes. It ebbs and flows. At one point, the Romans were on top, and then, they weren't. And then, others, rose to the fore. And, we had the British Empire at one point. And, I mean, all the various, like, empires of history. So, yeah, while you are currently on top, maybe you are, like, less, at risk of the consequences directly. But there's no guarantee how, what if China ends up in, 20 years being, the strongest military in the world? Like, what if they want to do this to us then? Once you just allow this sort of thing to occur, basically at any point in time that somebody has, more muscle than you, militarily, now they could turn around and do it to you. So this is kind of why we, need to have the view here of, we should act like this could happen to anybody and make the rules accordingly, and right. If you don't want to get invaded or bombed or have, missiles tearing your cities apart in the middle of the night all of a sudden out of the blue, then, maybe we shouldn't be doing it to others. And it just sets a very dangerous precedent. And again, if, somebody else, North Korea, China, obviously if Russia, decided to try it somewhere else beyond Ukraine, obviously they're already kind of doing it. Like we just, there's no more like grounds for us to be like, well, you can't do that, because, well, we did it, like,
right.
You just lose any kind of credibility you just lose all credibility to say anything about these kinds of things, these kinds of aggressive actions in the future. And that should be disconcerting to everybody, Americans included. Even if, like, maybe we aren't currently concerned about being the ones, bombed in the night. That's not a guarantee that we might not be in that spot in the future,
Right.
And
if
just to say right, nothing.
Then
yeah. To say nothing of just like, hey, maybe we shouldn't like go around killing people, like maybe that's just like bad on its face. Even if we were going to be in power for another 1,000 years, like that's still probably not nice to do, like this is obviously,
Right. So any way you look at it, it is bad, right? You don't want might to make right, because in that way, if you ever lose the might, then you're at the whim of someone else's desires, right? And in a practical sense, it and we kind of come at this from a less hawkish sense, right? Probably more leaning towards pacifism. But if the state of play is might makes right, then you're setting up a system, a game where everyone needs to acquire as much might as possible. And so we have all these resources going towards military and violent conflict resolution methods and technology, rather than other technologies or other other investments
goals
into human flourishing. And I
Yeah,
think in a way that, again, if you're designing the system with the goal of we want people that exist in the world to be happy or live meaningful lives or not live in a war-torn hellscape, then we don't want to design that system this way that might makes
yeah,
right, because then that takes a lot of resources away from much better and much more worthwhile
yeah.
endeavors and puts it entirely into military aspects.
Yeah, and in the even in the America First kind of vein, which like Trump kind of ran on, like yeah, you're gonna end up pumping more and more money into defense spending. This is what happened to the Soviet Union towards the end when they collapsed. They just kept, because they got into the arms race with us, and they just kept putting more and more resources into military stuff, and then their infrastructure and their economy on the home front collapsed. Right, like
Right,
every $1 billion that goes towards new aircraft carriers or missiles or bombs or bullets or whatever else is $1 billion that doesn't go to a high speed rail system or improving
yeah,
healthcare or education. Like none of these things do anything for the American people. Because let's point out, even if the U.S. oil companies do get back in there and start making profits, still that's going to have a much more limited effect in scope on how it improves, the lives of Americans. It's going to make some people a lot of money, but again, as we know, especially when taxes are being reduced and stuff, that's not going to get back to like most of the regular people in America. So like even these
trickle
things that
down
are
economics is broadly speaking not worked, right? To
yeah,
say nothing of like the climate change aspects that. Is it a good idea to be gaining oil reserves so we have more oil? We should be getting
right,
off of oil. And
awful,
again, if you
right,
want to put into that national security framework, right, our
yeah,
reliance on other countries for a
yep,
non-renewable sources of energy like oil is
yep,
problematic, because then we're at the
yep,
whim of other countries economically and strategically,
yep,
right? So if we could build out a green infrastructure so we don't even have to care about oil anymore,
yeah,
then we no longer need to intervene in other countries' affairs to acquire oil, and we don't have to
yep.
worry about that as a concern.
Yeah, and two, right? I mean, who's going to end up, fighting these wars or, conducting these raids or whatever? It's mostly working class poor people that are
Of
in
course.
in the military. And so like, apparently we more or less pulled this off with only a few guys wounded. It sounds like nobody was killed, I guess, which is obviously pretty magical when it comes to military, operations, but that should not be presumed to be the way that it'll always be. And
Yeah.
certainly Venezuela, and for sure anybody else that we tangle with moving forward, given what we've just done, the odds of catching anybody else with their pants down to this degree should probably be viewed as, slim to none now, because clearly people know that all bets are off and we will try just about anything. So, I mean, like anybody else we would try this, which would probably be much more prepared, which means American servicemen and women would be probably getting killed somewhere too. And again, all for what? Um, and it's just a bad precedent all around. Even if Nicolas Maduro was a bad guy and was doing bad things, which I'm certainly willing to see that probably was true, at least in some part, right? We obviously get a lot of things filtered through the American media that have painted Venezuela in a very bad light for a very long time. There has been some reporting by like people like Abby Martin who did investigative pieces on some of their elections and stuff that has definitely poked holes in some of the Western narrative of just how undemocratic were all of their elections, and is it really the case that everybody hates him, and all of this. But regardless of that, right, is it our responsibility as a single nation to intervene anywhere that there is somebody abusing people or not? Again, I would argue if that was the case, then we would have done something about what Israel is doing.
Yeah.
We clearly don't care about that, at least when it's an ally that's doing it, someone that plays ball with us. So what is basically, the point of this? At the end of the day, other people, other countries have a responsibility to govern their own affairs. Obviously, if, the people of Venezuela wanted to rise up and, overthrow Maduro or whatever, that would also be their right or whatever to do that, if, to throw off, a tyrant or whatever, if that's, how they felt about him. But then again, it's also clear too, okay, so we just kidnapped him, but now what? Now there's like a power vacuum. Is the vice president just going to take over? Somebody else, maybe somebody worse. There's no guarantee that this is going to do anything at all to, actually improve things for, people living in Venezuela. And yeah, it's I think generally a bad idea to intervene in, foreign affairs without a lot of justification. I'm definitely not a pure pacifist or anything like that. I do think that there is such a thing as just war, although I do always think it should be very much like the last result, or the last resort rather, not the first thing that I definitely do not feel that in this particular case all other avenues were thoroughly exhausted before this was resorted to. This was done very quickly compared to normal procedures, and like you said, normally that building of some type of consensus and consent from some portion of other countries around the globe at a minimum. And definitely a precedent of one country acting unilaterally in their perceived own interest, without consulting anybody else, is just not a good, does not bode well for the remainder of the 21st century. We do not want this to be the way that, international geopolitics are carried out.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a reversal of, a large portion of the 20th century was defined by Pax Americana, right, where the U.S. is spending on the military, for better or worse, led to them being the global police force, right? And obviously, that was misused and abused in several fashions by the United States, depending on what perspective you're coming from. However, there were, in addition to those, deleterious effects, also benefits to global trade, which could be done in a relatively safe manner without having to worry about piracy or anything like that at sea, while the U.S. kept the seas safe. There was a reduction in the amount of wars that were being performed against between countries, because again there was that international community and that expectation that that international consent had to be built up before at least a global superpower or first world country or developed nation, were to engage in conflict with another sovereign nation. And all those things have receded. And again, the U.S. as the predominant superpower alone brought its own issues, right? But it also there were certainly some amount of benefits to it. And now that we're acting like a rogue nation, there's a breakdown of that order, which is problematic in a different way. So, there's issues when the U.S. is in charge and not acting correctly, but there's, probably a case to be made that there's more issues when the U.S. is not even trying to be perceived as acting correctly. That's where we're at. So we've gone from the U.S. being the world's police force to now being, as you said, the mafia boss that's trying to collect some revenue to prevent the windows from being broken. But who's going to be breaking the windows? I don't know. Just give us the money.
This is a very, very bad development. Of course, we don't know where it'll go from here. I mean, Trump certainly threatened that more strikes even on Venezuela could be in the offing, presumably if they don't do what we want, I guess. I don't know if we're going to end up putting, more boots on the ground there. Of course, that will definitely further escalate things. Even if this is like some kind of one and done thing or whatever, it's still a bad precedent and a bad idea. Even if Nicolas Maduro was like a genuinely bad actor, for his own people. Although again, there obviously are As I read, one Venezuelan commented that even though Maduro, isn't liked by everybody for sure in Venezuela, and has for sure done some probably terrible things. The idea of keeping your resources for yourself as your country, I don't have a problem with, and I don't see how you can really like argue against it. Like, why shouldn't the Venezuelans be the ones profiting from their oil resources, right? Their reserves. And this is the kind of thing that we just tend to ignore, and we do what's in our best interest, but what gives us the right, obviously, to do that? And that's what obviously Chavez did when he came to power initially.
Might gives us the right.
Well, and that's the problem. Yeah, and that's the problem. But that's the thing, is that it feels like this is just the modern day banana republic, right? It's just, we weren't the American United Fruit Companies weren't being able to keep exploiting the banana plantations and whatnot of Central America, so the U.S. rolls in with the military to install some right-wing dictator, to which again also shows that we clearly don't care about dictators or human rights or any of this. Right. What we care about is who's favorable to our interests, and in that, at least, I think Maduro was correct to not just capitulate to the U.S.'s like whims and desires, and which is probably why, to some degree, he has some portion, at least, of the population that supports him. And again, obviously, a lot of why the economic situation is so terrible there is because of the external sanctions that we have imposed on them and their sale of oil. And so that's the other thing. It's just like you can't, maybe he would have been more popular if like we hadn't have like destroyed their economy by not letting them trade their oil to anybody. I mean, we were seizing their oil tankers, just last week or whatever, right? Like essentially conducting high seas piracy with our military, and what gives us the right to dictate to another people? Again, just think in terms of if anybody told the U.S. like you can't trade your oil with whomever, or you can't send your lumber wherever, like we would all be up in arms here. There'd probably be plenty of Americans saying, oh, we should go to war with somebody, if they were to tell us what to do with our stuff. But then those same Americans won't stop and think for a second when we do that to somebody else. Like, why don't those people have the right to resist us on that front? And I think that's one of my big issues with all this too is, if Maduro was a villain to some degree, which I'm not disputing that probably was the case, he certainly wasn't the only villain in the mix, and we certainly are not the good guys, and haven't been for a damn long time. I mean, I'm not for sure. World War II is probably the last, completely justifiable war that we've been involved in. Maybe Korea, but really since then, for sure, pretty much everything that we've been involved in, we've been the aggressor and the bad guys, and the ones that didn't have the ethical justification for what we were doing. And Americans need to realize that, and they need to read some history, and they need to, wake up and smell the roses and realize that we aren't the good guys in this tale that we like to think that we are. And, maybe if anything, Trump is making that more obvious. Maybe more people will start to finally understand that. But this is a very bad situation. This is a very bad precedent, practically as well as ethically. And it doesn't bode well for the future on many fronts. And, it feels like a massive kind of regression from, again, the latter half of the 20th century was very imperfect, and we were already doing things that were illegal and unethical through much of that. But there was some effort made to move, I think, in the right direction, even allowing for our various coups and interventions that we had. There was a sense, I think, that we were trying to move further, in some ways at least, away from war and violent conflict being the order of the day as opposed to the exception. But
Right.
now,
There are at least norms in place, right, within that
yeah,
structure that kept us in line. In many other countries, in line to an extent that they at least had to give a notion of, ethical rightness. And again, as you said, imperfect, and certainly there were issues that cropped up with that, but at least everyone was pledging, was posturing to give a pledge or a fidelity to ethics. And now, when you don't even have that, you open up, you expand the amount of possibilities for violent intervention and for doing pure power grabs, which is a move in the wrong direction.
yeah, I think that it's probably fair to say that we were at least in theory, and often what we said in our rhetoric, we were doing our best to listen to the better angels of our nature. But this definitely, especially coupled with things like what Russia is doing in Ukraine, what Israel is doing in Palestine, it feels very strongly now that we are, if anything, giving in more to our inner demons, and moving actively now in the wrong direction as the world. And I think that if the future of humanity is to have a more rosy outlook, we need to do something about this. We need to course correct back. We have to make these actions, perhaps be the last, actions in this regard, and do our best not to allow them in the future. But it does not bode well, and it's a dark day for humanity, and really for the future of humanity as a species, just the planet. Again, if we start putting more and more, if now countries are like, oh well, we better beef up, like you said, our military resources, because the U.S. or Russia or somebody else might just decide to come in and take us over, then now that's more resources that aren't being put into green energy, or aren't being put into infrastructure or healthcare, or better transportation. They're not being put into fighting climate change. Like all of these, like they're going against the future of all humans in a way that's very bad and does not bode well.
Yeah, and at a time when economic inequality is on the rise, climate change is on the rise, ecological impacts are significant. We need to be focusing on other problems rather than how can we put ourselves in a position that best can make war so that everyone is safe, because there is no agreement that we need real justification to make war. And militaries obviously are notoriously expensive on the carbon front, and as we head into the end game here in terms of climate change, we need to be concerned with those sorts of things, and we need to be moving in the right direction in terms of reducing our global carbon footprint, rather than ramping up the activities that do some of the worst contribution to that. Yeah,
absolutely,
carbon footprint.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
it's all moving the wrong direction, and it does harken back. I don't know, at least in my mind, to the surprise that I felt, and I wasn't, and obviously pretty widespread, I think, surprise to Russia's bellicosity when they invaded Ukraine, in a way that while in the aftermath, like, oh, okay, it's not surprising that Russia invaded. If anyone's going to invade, if everyone's belligerent in the region, it's Russia. But still, the fact that they transgressed that mutually agreed upon notion and norm, that without any legitimate reasons, broadly recognized legitimate reasons for intervention, we're not going to engage in a violent incursion on another sovereign country. And that was completely trampled over by Russia in a way that I think was surprising, and unfortunately is now continued by the United States, who probably in modernity are even more of an important actor than Russia, and it's all moving in the wrong direction.
Yep. So I guess as always, on the Socratic, we want people to think about these issues for themselves. Read articles. Try to get varied sources of information. Maybe even talking with some people from the people impacted. On the internet, things like this. We obviously have the ability to get information that isn't completely curated. Try to do your best to be skeptical of things. Generally, if the U.S. tells you something about some place, and especially if it's a justification for why we're about to bomb there, be highly skeptical of that, and probably don't take it at face value. We need people that are going to be aware and paying attention and reading and discussing things and thinking these things through, because they're going to have far-ranging impacts that'll are going to eventually reach us in one way or the other, whether that's somebody's family member in the military getting killed in some stupid war somewhere,
Yeah.
or economic downturn, or any other number of things, or other wars beginning because of bad precedents. All this stuff, at some point these things are going to impact you, even if you think that like currently you're insulated by being behind the shield of the big bully in the room. Stuff has a way of finding its way to you, and we all live together on this planet, and we need to find more ways to coexist with each other, not more ways to fight each other.
Yeah.
And that would be, I guess, my final sort of exhortation to the audience. Please do not contribute to a world where violence is more easily permissible and possible.
I think it's a great word to end on. So, all right, everyone be safe out there. It's a scary world in many ways, but hopefully we can work together to make it a better world.
Yeah, hopefully so. That's all
right,
for
John.
us today at the Socratic.
Yep. We'll sign off there. Check you later.
Till next time. Yeah,
Till next
peace.
time. Peace and love.